Welcome to our channel, where we uncover the darkest truths lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life. Tonight, we delve into a true story that will challenge your perception of safety and make you look at strangers in a new, terrifying light. It's a case that reveals how a quiet, unassuming man hid a chilling obsession, turning the lives of hundreds of women into a 6-year nightmare of fear and violation. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our deep dives into the crime. It began almost imperceptibly, a faint, insidious sense of unease that seemed to creep into the very fabric of Fairhaven, a town that, to the casual observer, was the very picture of suburban normalcy. On the surface, it was a place of calm predictability. Rows of identical houses, manicured lawns gleaming after morning dew, children's laughter echoing off white picket fences, and neighbors greeting each other with practiced warmth. The town pulsed with a quiet rhythm, a sense of security born of routine. But beneath that serene exterior, a darkness was beginning to stir, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, yet meticulously calculated, patient, and unervingly intimate. The earliest incidents were so trivial, so easily dismissed, that the women themselves initially brushed them off. A phone call that ended in silence, a shadow glimpsed on a deserted street corner, the creeping feeling of being watched when there was no one there. These were small anomalies, easily rationalized. Yet the subtle pattern began to emerge, insidious in its intricacy. A young barista, busy with the morning rush, received an email that stopped her cold. A photograph of herself, unposed, caught in a fleeting moment at the cafe, a snapshot she had never realized had been taken. A high school teacher, parking her car in a familiar lot, found a note tucked beneath the windshield wiper. It was penned in a delicate, almost intimate hand, recounting a detail of her life she had shared with no one. And in the quiet solitude of her home, a grandmother discovered a small, hand-carved wooden bird on her windowsill, a perfect replica of the one she had lost decades earlier, a token that should have existed only in memory. At first, each woman sought to rationalize the intrusion. Perhaps coincidence, a prank, or an overactive imagination. But as the incidents multiplied, the veneer of explanation began to crumble. The events were precise, personal, and unervingly deliberate. Letters did not merely observe, they catalogued minutiae of daily life. The time she brewed her morning coffee, the number of sugars she preferred, the precise routes taken to school or work, the fleeting habits only the most attentive observer would notice. It was as if someone had been inhabiting the invisible spaces of their lives for years, mapping each step, each gesture, each moment of vulnerability, with the cold, obsessive diligence of a scientist cataloging specimens in a laboratory. The terror escalated subtly but relentlessly. Ordinary movements became fraught with tension. A glance over a shoulder sparked panic. Shadows in a window induced heart-racing dread. Every familiar space, their homes, workplaces, streets walked daily without thought, was tainted by the unshakable presence of the unseen watcher. The predator was not an external threat in the conventional sense. He was omnipresent, intangible, and invisible, a phantom who understood their lives as completely as they themselves did. Sleep became shallow and broken. Every sound in the night a possible signal, every pedestrian or passing car a potential harbinger of observation. The quiet unease that had once been dismissed as paranoia grew into a suffocating psychological pressure, a constant, unrelenting fear that gnawed at the edges of their sanity. As the weeks turned into months, the intrusions became bolder, more personal, and more manipulative. Coffee cups inscribed with their initials appeared on doorsteps. Phone calls came at the dead of night, carrying nothing but silence, yet filled with the undeniable weight of someone knowing. Shadows seemed to linger in spaces they should not exist, whispers of presence that left a lingering chill. Each act was crafted not to harm physically, but to dismantle the fragile boundaries of privacy and security, to erode confidence, to ensure that the women were never alone in their own lives. They were hunted in the most intimate sense, studied, catalogued, reduced to moving targets in a meticulous psychological game. Eventually, the women, isolated and frightened, began to recognize the pattern that tied their experiences together. They formed a clandestine online forum, a private digital space where stories could be shared without fear of discovery. As they recounted the intrusions, a horrifying clarity emerged. The incidents were not random. They were the work of a single, highly methodical individual predator who had invested years, perhaps even decades, in observing, documenting, and mastering the art of fear. Each woman was chosen deliberately, their lives scrutinized with an obsessive precision that defied understanding. The realization was terrifying. The predator was not merely a shadow at the edge of vision, but a calculated, intelligent presence who had reduced their lives to patterns, timetables, and observations, mastering the art of terror without ever revealing his face. Every step they took, every routine, every private gesture had been mapped, analyzed, and recorded. The invisible hunter had infiltrated their world so completely that the very act of existing had become an exhibition of vulnerability. Fairhaven, once a haven of suburban tranquility, was now a landscape haunted by invisible eyes. The predator's reach extended into the most intimate corners of life, a reminder that safety is often a fragile illusion, that normalcy can conceal the most profound horror. For the women, and for the community, the lesson was terrifyingly clear. The most dangerous monsters are not those who confront you with violence, but those who watch silently, patiently, and completely until your life itself becomes prey. The subtle dread that had first arrived as a whisper had grown into precise, calculated terror that had stalked them not for days, not for months, but for years. It was a quiet, intimate, and profoundly invasive horror that transformed ordinary existence into a perpetual state of hyper-awareness. In every shadow, every letter, every phone call, the women of Fairhaven confronted a singular truth: that the predator was not simply outside their lives, but had been inside them all along, a master of the unseen, a specter of obsession, and a force that would linger in memory long after the first phone call, the first photograph, and the first carved bird had been discovered. The turning point in the case arrived not in a blaze of sudden revelation, but quietly, through the collective desperation of those who had long suffered in isolation. Women across Fairhaven, each haunted by a creeping, persistent dread, began to find one another online. At first, their interactions were tentatively simple: "Has anyone else noticed strange things happening?" But over time, the threads of their individual experiences intertwined, weaving a tapestry of horror too vast to ignore. As they shared emails, photographs, and small, meticulously documented notes, an alarming pattern began to emerge. These incidents, which had seemed isolated and trivial, were not random. They were the careful orchestration of a single, deeply calculating mind. Among the people who stumbled across the forum was a young local data analyst named Sarah. She had initially logged on for a research project for a statistics class, curious to explore the way communities interact online. What she found shocked her. Each post, each report, contained clues, times, dates, locations, and small personal details that suggested an observer with an intimate knowledge of the victim's daily routines. Her pulse quickened as she began to plot the incidents on a digital map, layering timestamps and geolocations, creating a visual representation of the terror that had unfolded over 6 long years. The map revealed an almost impossible level of precision. The man behind these acts was not opportunistic. He was methodical, almost scientific in his approach, following precise routes, tracking patterns of movement, and striking in ways that left minimal evidence. Sarah's late nights were consumed by analysis. She noticed subtle consistencies: the time of day certain notes were left, the recurring sighting near particular coffee shops, the moments when surveillance footage coincided with the victim's reports. The perpetrator's obsession was revealed not through overt violence, but in his painstaking collection of data, chillingly intimate stalking that left the victims aware of his presence but powerless to stop it. Each act was a calculated invasion, designed to instill fear while maintaining the illusion that he was invisible, untouchable, omnipresent yet unseen. Armed with this digital evidence, Sarah went to the police. Detective Reynolds, a veteran officer who had initially dismissed the individual complaints as trivial or coincidental, was forced to confront the magnitude of what he had overlooked. The young analyst laid out her maps, her charts, and her meticulous documentation, showing him how the incidents were interconnected. a 6-year campaign of psychological terror spanning the town like a shadow that refused to dissipate. Reynolds' skepticism dissolved as he followed the thread of Sarah's analysis, the pattern emerging with a horrifying clarity. This was not a series of petty harassment incidents. It was the signature of a predator with patience, precision, and a compulsive need for control. A man who treated his victims as data points lives to be observed and catalogued for his perverse gratification. The investigation shifted dramatically. What had been a series of dead-end reports transformed into a focused, high-stakes manhunt. Police began cross-referencing Sarah's findings with security footage, credit card records, cell phone towers, and neighborhood surveillance cameras. Detectives walked the streets, retracing the predator's routes, seeking the smallest anomaly that might reveal his identity. The tension was palpable. Every shadow seemed suspect, every passerby a potential witness, every quiet suburban street a stage upon which this invisible monster had played his twisted games. The psychological profile that began to emerge was as chilling as the data itself. The man's motive was not robbery, not random violence, not even necessarily sexual assault. It was control. It was intimacy twisted into obsession, a compulsion to dominate and terrify without leaving a trace. His patience over 6 years had allowed him to perfect his stalking, to adapt and evolve with the slightest hint of suspicion, always staying one step ahead, always invisible. The detective realized that catching him would require equal precision, a calculated strategy to draw out a predator who had spent years studying every possible escape route, every loophole in the law, every behavioral pattern of his prey. In the quiet of the police precinct, late nights were consumed by mapping, planning, and theorizing. Each new piece of information uncovered by Sarah was a revelation. Each pattern identified a step closer to exposing the unseen menace that had terrorized the town. The air was thick with urgency, anxiety, and fun. It just for the investigators. But for the women who had endured years of silent terror, their private lives invaded and their sense of safety shattered. Fairhaven, a town that had once seemed idyllic, had become a hunting ground, and the monster who had haunted it for years was still out there, lurking in the patterns, waiting for the perfect moment to act again. Detective Reynolds leaned back in his chair one night, staring at Sarah's maps spread across the table, a cold realization settling over him. This was no ordinary criminal. This was a mind trained in patience, in meticulous observation, in invisibility itself. And to stop him, they would need to become just as precise, just as patient, and ready to confront the darkness that had stalked Fairhaven for half a decade. The hunt had only just begun, but now, for the first time, there was a plan, a path forward, and a faint glimmer of hope that the invisible terror might finally be unmasked. With Sarah's painstakingly compiled data as their guide, Detective Reynolds and his team began to narrow the net, piecing together threads of surveillance footage, digital breadcrumbs, and behavioral patterns that spanned years. Their target, once an invisible shadow behind layers of paranoia and fear, finally emerged from the web of anonymity. Arthur Miller. On paper, he was unremarkably a man in his late 30s, employed at a nondescript office job in Fairhaven's commercial district, living alone in a modest, beige brick townhouse. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, entirely forgettably a man whose presence barely registered in the rhythm of everyday life. To the outside world, he was the very definition of ordinary, the kind of man who could sit unnoticed in a crowded coffee shop, his gaze drifting over the room without attracting a single thought from anyone else. But what the investigators discovered after obtaining a search warrant shattered any illusion of ordinariness. Arthur's home, particularly the basement, was a meticulously curated shrine to obsession and control. Every corner was regimented with cold precision. Rows of filing cabinets, each labeled with a woman's name, stretched along the walls. Every drawer open to reveal a carefully maintained dossier. Photographs downloaded from social media, annotated screenshots of private messages, hand-copied schedules, lists of grocery purchases, and even notes on minute details: how she held her coffee, the timing of her commute, the cadence of her laugh. Each file represented more than observation. It was a map of a life, painstakingly reconstructed and claimed as his own. He had tracked every encounter, every subtle movement, cataloging each interaction with obsessive care. There were cross-references, color-coded tabs, and timelines spanning years, creating a sprawling, interconnected web of surveillance. The walls of the basement were lined not just with files, but with bulletin boards covered in strings and pins, connecting names, places, and dates like some macabre work of art. The detectives found charts showing the frequency of appearances, annotated with personal insights, vulnerabilities, and what he called emotional patterns, an effort to render each woman's inner life legible and, in his mind, controllable. The scale of his obsession was staggering. Hundreds of women, dozens of neighborhoods, years of accumulation, all catalogued with a historian's rigor and a psychopath's intensity. This was not the behavior of a man acting on impulse. This was the work of someone who had devoted himself entirely to the act of possession. For Arthur, it was never about violence or direct harm. It was about control, about turning lives into data points, reducing living people to artifacts he could manipulate and dominate from a distance. The terror he inflicted was psychological, subtle, invisible, yet all-encompassing. Detectives could barely comprehend the 6-year span of his operation. It was one thing to hear complaints, to see individual incidents, but quite another to witness the depth of the planning and patience required to maintain such a vast network of surveillance. The basement was a mausoleum of voyeurism, a testament to meticulous cruelty disguised as quiet obsession. Every file, every note, every photograph was a small act of domination, an assertion that Arthur Miller could orchestrate fear and intimacy without ever being confronted, without ever being caught until now. As Detective Reynolds stepped back, surveying the room, a chill ran through the team. This was no ordinary criminal, no typical stalker. This was a man who had made obsession an art form, who had systematically stripped hundreds of lives of privacy and peace, layer by layer over 6 years. The magnitude of it was almost too much to process. The timelines, the cross-references, the obsessive notes detailing the minutiae of daily life was methodical, deliberate, and horrifying. And as the team realized the true breadth of his operation, the full extent of his predatory genius became clear. This was a predator who had eluded justice for years, hiding in plain sight, a master of patience and control, whose victims had been under silent siege for half a decade. The basement, lined with the tangible evidence of his crimes, was more than a crime scene, it was a window into the mind of a monster. And as the detectives carefully bagged documents, copied files, and cataloged evidence, they understood the chilling reality. Arthur Miller had not just stalked lives. He had claimed them in the way a collector claims rare artifacts dispassionately, obsessively, and with absolute certainty that no one could stop him. For the victims, for the investigators, and for the town of Fairhaven, the full scope of his obsession would take months, perhaps years, to fully grasp. And yet, finally, for the first time in 6 years, the invisible monster had been caught. With the mountain of evidence meticulously compiled, cross-referenced, and analyzed, Detective Reynolds and his team began to craft a plan of precision, a high-stakes operation designed to bring Arthur Miller, a man whose life had been a shadowed labyrinth of obsession, into custody. They knew him better than anyone could have anticipated. He was predictable, almost mechanistic in his habits, and consumed by a compulsion to control, to observe, to dominate. Every detail mattered to him, every step he took was calculated, and every intrusion into his victims' lives followed a rigid, obsessive routine. To ensnare such a predator required a strategy that mirrored his own compulsions, exploiting the very patterns he relied upon. The decoy chosen for this delicate operation was Officer Jessica Carter, a young, unassuming detective whose daily life, carefully choreographed for the operation, mirrored the routines of Arthur's previous victims. Each morning, she arrived at the same cafe at precisely the same time, ordered the same cappuccino, and lingered just long enough to be observed without suspicion. Her commute followed the exact routes Arthur had previously catalogued, and her stops along the way, errands, jogging routes, even walks with her dog, were all executed with calculated predictability. Every gesture, every habit was monitored, recorded, and transmitted in real time to the surveillance teams hidden discreetly along her path. In unmarked vehicles, behind street signs, perched in the windows of neighboring buildings. Nothing was left to chance. Arthur's patterns would be tracked, predicted and used against him, but without alerting him to the trap closing silently around him. At first, the operation yielded only minor hints. A lone car parked unusually at the end of a quiet street, a shadow glimpsed across a darkened park, the brief flicker of movement in a window that should have been empty. The officers held their collective breath each day, waiting for the predator to act, their anticipation mounting with every passing hour. Days turned into a tense rhythm of observation, analysis, and silent speculation. And then, just as predicted, Arthur began to show signs of engagement. He emerged from the hidden recesses of his self-imposed anonymity, creeping along familiar streets with the mechanical precision of a man possessed by obsession. Cameras captured him as he raised his long lenses toward Jessica's apartment window, followed her morning jog, and photographed her at the cafe with a disturbing intensity that revealed the depths of his compulsive fixation. Every careful step he took, every glance he directed, every photograph he captured confirmed the obsessive patterns that had defined him for 6 years. The psychological tension of the operation weighed heavily on all involved. For the surveillance team, every moment was taut with anxiety, the click of a camera shutter, the creak of a gate, the faint rustle of leaves carried on the wind, any of it a potential trigger for disaster. For Jessica herself, the decoy, the burden was heavier still. She had to inhabit the life of a target, maintain the routines meticulously, and act oblivious while knowing, at every second, that a predator with a terrifying history was watching her with relentless scrutiny. She moved through the streets like an actress on a stage, every gesture under silent surveillance, every smile calculated to bait a man who had never imagined he would be confronted. Finally, the moment came that all the preparation had been leading toward. As Jessica returned to her parked car, her movements unhurried but precise, Arthur approached the vehicle. He crouched behind a hedge with the predatory patience that had defined him for years, carefully placing a folded note under the windshield wiper. Every letter, every phrase, every intimate detail on the paper had been culled from years of observation, a testament to his obsession and mastery of psychological control. It was the culmination of his 6-year campaign, a declaration of ownership, a ritual of intimidation, a manifestation of the invisible power he believed he wielded over another human being. Then, with startling abruptness, the carefully constructed silence shattered. From behind lampposts, parked cars, and alleys, officers surged forward in perfect synchronization. Shouts cut through the early morning stillness. The tension of half a week, half a month, half a year of investigation crystallized in a single, explosive moment. Arthur froze, body rigid, eyes darting between the decoy and the encroaching swarm of law enforcement. For the first time, he confronted a reality that could not be manipulated, monitored, or controlled. He was surrounded, exposed, and utterly powerless. The illusion of omnipotence that had shielded him for 6 years dissolved in the stark, unyielding light of authority. He offered no resistance. His hands, once instruments of obsessive dominance over hundreds of lives, hung limp by his sides. His face, pale and taut, betrayed the first flickers of disbelief, confusion, and dawning comprehension. All of his elaborate plans, his meticulous stalking, his years of secret control had come to nothing. For all his cunning, for all his obsessive preparation, Arthur Miller was no longer the omnipresent shadow. He was human, fragile, and mortal, finally, irreversibly powerless. Detective Reynolds stepped forward with handcuffs at the ready, reading the rights with procedural precision, but beneath the calm veneer ran a river of grim satisfaction. Every painstaking hour of evidence collection, every surveillance stakeout, every data point painstakingly plotted had led to this single, irreversible moment of reckoning. The predator had fallen, reduced from the terrifying ghost in the town's collective imagination to a solitary, ordinary man enveloped by the very power he had sought to elude. As officers guided him to the squad car, the quiet suburban streets of Fairhaven seemed to breathe again. The shadow that had haunted the town for 6 long years, invisible yet omnipresent, obsessed yet unknowable, was gone. The tension, fear, and suffocating anxiety that had gripped the women of the town, and indeed the entire community, had finally been met with the certainty of justice. Arthur Miller, the man who had thought himself untouchable, learned the final, inescapable truth. The ghosts he had conjured were illusions, his control an empty mirage, and the lives he had sought to possess could not be contained by fear alone. The town exhaled, the victims could begin to breathe, and the meticulous predator was at last revealed, restrained, and accounted for. Arthur Miller's arrest marked the end of a 6-year reign of meticulously orchestrated terror. Yet for the hundreds of women whose lives he had infiltrated, it was only the beginning of a new and far more personal nightmare. Each life he had touched or rather violated was a carefully constructed story, catalogued with the obsessive precision of a historian obsessed with control. Now, the quiet suburbs of Fairhaven, once serene and familiar, were suffused with the bitter awareness that an unseen predator had walked among them, moving silently through their routines, watching, documenting, and possessing their most private moments without detection. The police, armed with Arthur's voluminous files, hundreds of meticulously cross-referenced dossiers containing photographs, schedules, grocery lists, personal habits, and intimate details of relationships, embarked on the painstaking and emotionally harrowing task of reaching out to each victim. Detective Reynolds personally oversaw the operation, aware that what awaited these women was not merely a factual recounting of events, but a raw, emotional revelation that would shatter the illusion of safety they had taken for granted. Each phone call was an agonizing descent into shock and disbelief. When the detective uttered a woman's name and began to describe her life, it was as though he were recounting a parallel existence she had never known. The coffee shop she visited every Thursday, the park bench where she read on Sunday afternoons, the quiet habits and fleeting gestures that Arthur had observed, documented, and analyzed with clinical detachment. For many, the recognition was immediate and terrifying, the subtle sense of unease, the vague feeling of being watched that had lingered for years, suddenly coalesced into a horrifying truth. They were not imagining it. They had been prey, marked and catalogued by a man whose obsession knew no bounds. The emotional toll was staggering. Some women wept as they listened, their hands trembling as they clutched the phone, finally understanding that the paranoia they had dismissed as a rational intuition was instead a signal their subconscious had long recognized. Others were frozen, eyes wide, unable to process the grotesque violation of their privacy, the theft of their lives' details by a mind that had calculated every nuance and movement. Each revelation tore at the fabric of trust, of security, of the assumed invulnerability of everyday life. The cumulative effect was like a shadow descending over the community, a pervasive, psychological echo of the predator who had haunted them silently for years. Arthur Miller's trial became a national sensation, but the headlines could not fully capture the psychological magnitude of his crimes. His conviction was swift, yet the true story, the insidious nature of the violation, was far more chilling than any court could render. His crimes were not violent in the traditional sense. No weapons were drawn, no direct physical assaults committed. Yet the devastation he wrought was profound, intimate, and permanent. He had weaponized observation, curiosity, and obsession itself, turning his victims' everyday lives into a personal theater of control, a meticulously choreographed nightmare in which they were unaware participants. For Detective Reynolds and his team, the case was a study in human depravity, a demonstration of how the most dangerous predators can be the ones who fade into the crowd, who are quietly diligent, methodical, and invisible. Arthur's files, once dry documents of data, became testament to the perverse power of knowledge when coupled with obsession. Every photograph, every detailed note, every subtle observation was a symbol of the quiet terror he inflicted, a reminder that the most intimate violation does not always involve force, but the ruthless appropriation of privacy, the meticulous intrusion into another's sense of self. For the women, the aftermath was complicated and enduring. Therapy and support groups offered some solace, yet the knowledge that their lives had been mapped and possessed would linger. The sense of vulnerability could never be fully erased. For years to come, a subtle caution would accompany their every glance at a stranger, their every unguarded moment in public, a psychological scar inflicted by a predator who had existed in plain sight. The national dialogue that emerged from the case emphasized a terrifying truth. The most dangerous monsters are often invisible, inhabiting the everyday spaces we consider safe, observing without permission, shaping their own reality at the expense of others. They are silent, methodical, patient, and utterly devoid of empathy. They weaponize ignorance itself. Arthur Miller was no longer free to terrorize, yet his crimes left a legacy that would haunt an entire community and an entire nation for years, a cautionary tale of the fragile boundary between trust and obsession, between normalcy and the monstrous hidden just beneath the surface of ordinary life.